Okay, so this is lesson 5.2, which is our very last block in this particular project, which is the applique block. And what you're going to need is your cutouts of your 4 large petals and your 4 small petals, which have been traced onto the steam seam, and at this point just roughly cut out with a little bit of space all the way around. You don't want to cut them exactly on the line just yet. And with each of these, we're going to choose the 2 fabrics you want to use. I happen to use fabric 6 for the large petals and fabric 8 for the small petals, but obviously this is the last block and you've got plenty of scraps left over, so if you prefer a different combination you can use whichever ones you want. And again, wrong side is what we're going to put the steam seam on. When you peel away the backing, you just need to make sure that the sticky fusible webbing is actually stuck to the paper that has the shape that you've drawn. Okay, so just make sure before you pull all the way off that the sticky bit is adhering to the correct side. If it isn't, it is possible to just kind of push it over and it will stick to that bit of paper. So all of these, we're just going to take them, we're going to put them on the wrong side of your fabric, and it doesn't really matter how you lay them, just obviously they can't overlap each other, but you can put them in. Sometimes if you've got a directional print or something, you might want them all going a certain way. I'm not really bothered with this. Okay, here's one where my webbing is going to the wrong side, so I'm just going to kind of push it and make it stay with the bit of paper that I want it to. So that's the 4 large ones, and I'm going to take the paper backing off of the small ones. And you can kind of initially, it'll stick a little bit when you put it down, just a little bit of pressure. But once you get them all on, what we're going to do is take it over to the iron and actually put heat on them, and that'll really make them stick nicely to the back of the fabric so that you can cut these shapes out. Okay, so I'm going to go give these an iron. Okay, so I've ironed both of these, and now we're ready to actually cut the shapes out. So at this point, you're actually going to cut your petals out just right on the actual drawn line. And so you'll cut out all 4 of the large ones and all 4 of the small ones. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with cutting all of these out, but basically just cut all of them out, and then I'll just go cut those and cut back when they're done. Okay, so what I've done now is I've cut all 4 of the large petals and the small petals out. I'm now ready for the background fabric. Now what I've done with my background fabric is just so that I would have some creases, which basically are some lines just to help me center my design. What I did first was just fold the fabric into 4s and press that, and then after you've done that, fold it on the diagonal one way and press those 2 lines, then fold it on the diagonal the other way to press those lines. And what that does is it gives you some lines to work with here on your background fabric without having to draw them, because if you draw lines on, you need to remove them. So this is just we'll be able to easily remove these when we press it. So essentially, if you look at your instructions, you've got your 4 large petals, they go on the diagonal lines, your 4 smaller petals go on the straight lines, and you can place them however you want. Just to try and sort of keep everything centered and symmetrical, what I did for the the larger petals, which I put on first, is I measured a 1/2 inch away from that center where everything intersects, a 1/2 inch out on that diagonal line, and then put the point of the large petal at that 1/2 inch point, and then of course, you know, lined up the other point so that it stayed on the line. Okay, so the easiest way to do that is to find the diagonal going, if I want to put this one on, I find the diagonal going the other direction, and I put the 1/2 inch of my acrylic ruler along that line there, and then so that is now the edge of that ruler is a 1/2 inch away from the center. I'm going to take that backing paper off. I'm going to put this point, I'm going to put this point right up against the ruler and make sure that the other one is lined up there. And then I could do the same thing in the opposite direction. Just again, I'll just move the ruler so now the 1/2 inch on this side is going along the diagonal in the other direction, and I could put this one on. Right up against the ruler and put the other point so that it's on our diagonal line. Do the same thing the opposite directions. So it's just a 1/2 inch away from the center. If you want yours to be 3/4 inches away from the center, it can be whatever you want. And if you place it down, it's not quite where you want it. This steam seam is repositionable until you iron it, of course. And then it's a permanent fuse after you iron it. So you can just kind of keep playing with it and picking it up and putting it back down and getting it exactly how you want it. And then when you're happy, you can iron it. Okay, so that is the large petals. My smaller petals, what I did was I positioned them 1.5 inches away from the center. So this time you're measuring from the lines that go straight up and down and side to side. So that is basically my 1.5 inch line there on the ruler, and I've just placed it so that I can see the diagonal, not diagonal, the straight crease underneath it. And then the same thing, just put the point where the ruler is, and the other point, just make sure it's on the line. This is a 3 inch wide ruler actually, so I don't have to move it to do the one underneath. Which is nice. That's that one, and then we've just got to turn this. Hopefully the light here is good enough for you to, it's getting late in the day, later than I usually do these videos, getting a little bit dark. And that's that one, we're almost there. And then that's that one there. So so these are all ready now to take to the iron, and we're gonna give that a good press with the iron, and that's going to fuse all of these pieces permanently to the background. Okay, so what I've done here is I now have all of my pieces are fused onto the background, and I'm sewing each of the pieces down because they're fused, but we want to make sure that the edges are going to stay down. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to use blanket stitch in this instance, and we want to sew this so that the outside edge of the blanket stitch is just catching the outside edge of your applique design. So we're just going to work our way around the petal shape, and if you come off a little bit, it's really not the end of the world. You really just want to be able to catch the edges. Now as you get to a point, you're going to need to just slow down a little bit. I like to pivot when I'm on the outside of the point and I'm on sort of the right side of the design, and then probably I'd say we do one like that and then start going in the next direction. were doing a zigzag, you're going to be doing an exact same way. The outside of your zigzag is going to be what hits the outside edge. Just choose a small zigzag, or if you prefer to do a straight stitch, you can do that too. Okay, so we're coming to our second point. You want to slow down. I'm going to stop on the outside. I'm going to do a little in. Probably just turn again there so that my little inside prong is going the right way. And then we're going to come back to where we started from here. I'm just going to overlap where I started by a stitch or two, and then I'm going to do a reverse, which is, sorry, my finger's in the way there. Just reverse a stitch or two, and that's it. We're all done. Okay, so I've finished now stitching down all the petals on my applique block. Now what I need to do is we need to square this up and trim it back. It's a 13-inch square that we use for the background, but it needs to be 12.5 inches. And I like to square it up after I've stitched everything down, because sometimes things get a little bit warped when you're stitching around the petals. So so we can square it up. Now, to get this to 12.5 inch square, you can use a 12.5 inch square ruler, but if you don't have a 12.5 inch square ruler, you can basically just use those two sort of center lines and even the diagonal lines, and if you can't still see them, you can always refold the block and repress it so that you can see them. To get a 12.5 inch square and still have it sort of be centered, if you measure 6 1/4 and 6 1/4 and then 6 1/4 and 6 1/4 and you trim those, then that should give you your 12.5 inch square. Now, if you're using a square ruler, you kind of do something very similar to that by finding the 6 1/4 on your square ruler and line it up with that center line, and then find the 6 1/4 in the other direction and line it with the horizontal center line. And then you can actually just work your way around, just trimming the whole thing to a 12.5 inch square. So we're going to just go ahead and go up the side here and along the top. And then I'm actually, since it's all nicely placed there, just going to come around to the other side and cut. And cut. Okay, but if you only have a long ruler, you can still do the same thing by just measuring your 6 1/4 from that center line, cut, measure 6 1/4 and cut, and just do that in all 4 directions. So that is that put together. So now you are ready to sew your checkerboard units onto that. Sorry, I'm just finding mine. And so if you look at your instructions, you're basically going to sew the set of 6 checkerboard onto the side, and then after you've sewn that on, you're going to put the set of 8 onto the bottom. Okay, so I've sewn that first checkerboard of the 6 down the side. The next thing to do is to sew this one with the 8 onto the bottom. Remember, you've got 2 seams here that you can lock and pin. If you've pressed these seams as per the instructions, that seam's going to the right, this one's going to the left, this one's also going to the right, and that's going to the left. So you'll be able to lock and pin both of those. So just take them. Slide them in. Sorry, that's my dogs in the background playing. Okay, so we lock and pin, lock and pin. So those are the only actual seam intersections that you have to worry about, but remember to put a pin way over here at this other end, because these should be the same length, so you want them to end up at the same point. And I would put, at the minimum, I would put another one at the other end, so you've got a pin at each end, but also this is quite a long distance here, so I would probably put at least 1, maybe even 2 more pins in there, just to sort of hold all that together while you sew. Okay, so here is the checkerboard all stitched onto the applique. Now the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to take the star unit that we've already made, and you're now going to sew that to the bottom of the checkerboard. And remember, you've got all these seams here to lock and pin. And if you come across one where they're going in the same direction, don't worry about it. Just whichever one's convenient, push it in the opposite direction so that they're going the opposite way. And it'll be fine, I promise. Okay, so I've now sewn those 2 star units onto the bottom of that section. So that's all we need to do with that before we then sew it onto to the snowball unit section. Now in this case there were a couple of seams where they were going the same direction, so what I did was just flip one over, which you can see. This is the one that I flipped over here and here, and what you can do after you flipped it over and you've sewn it is just clip it shy of the, don't go all the way to the line of stitching obviously, but just clip that near the seam and just give that another press, and nobody's gonna know your little secrets.